Have you ever heard of a teenage girl leading an entire army? That's the story of Joan of Arc. A name that echoes through history as a symbol of courage and faith. She was a young peasant girl who claimed to hear divine voices. Voices that told her to save France from English domination during the 100 Years' War. And incredibly, she did. She lifted the siege of Orleans, led French armies to victory after victory, and stood by Charles VII as he was crowned king. It felt like a fairy tale. A miracle even. But as we all know, not all stories have a happy ending. Today, we're going to talk about the tragic final chapter of Joan's life. Story of betrayal, a rigged trial, and a fiery end that cemented her legacy forever. After her incredible successes, Joan's luck began to turn. During a minor skirmish in Compiègne in May 1430, she was captured by Burgundian soldiers, who were allies of the English. This was a massive prize. For months, she was held captive, moved from castle to castle. You'd think the king she helped crown, Charles VII, would rush to her rescue, right? Sadly, he made no serious effort to negotiate her release or pay her ransom. Joan, the savior of France, was abandoned. The Burgundians eventually sold her to their English allies for a hefty sum. For the English, this wasn't just about getting rid of a military threat. They wanted to destroy her reputation and, by extension, discredit the king she had crowned. The English handed Joan over to pro-English church officials in Rouen. They couldn't just execute her for defeating them in battle. They needed to prove she was a heretic, a witch, someone who dealt with the devil. This would invalidate her victories in Charles's coronation. So began her trial, a masterclass in injustice. The court was packed with clergymen who were politically biased against her. Joan, an illiterate teenager, had no lawyer and had to defend herself against dozens of learned theologians and legal experts. They questioned her for hours on end, day after day, trying to trap her in her own words. They grilled her about her visions, her faith, and even the way she dressed. One of the main charges against her was wearing men's clothing. To us, that sounds absurd, but back then, it was considered a serious religious offense. Joan explained she wore it for protection among soldiers, because her voices told her to. The judges twisted her answers, trying to paint her as defiant and heretical. They asked her complex theological questions, hoping to catch her in a doctrinal error. In one famous exchange, they asked if she knew she was in God's grace. It was a trap. If she said yes, it was blasphemous pride. If she said no, it was an admission of guilt. Her brilliant reply was, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Even her accusers were stunned by her wit. Despite her cleverness and unwavering faith, the outcome was predetermined. After months of psychological pressure and threats of torture, they finally wore her down. In a moment of weakness and fear, facing the stake, she signed a document recanting her claims and promising to wear women's clothes. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. Just a few days later, the judges found her back in men's clothing. Why? Some accounts say her female clothes were taken away, leaving her no choice. Others believe she realized she had betrayed her divine mission and chose to be true to her faith, even if it meant death. This relapse into heresy was exactly what her enemies wanted. It sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, 19-year-old Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. She was tied to a tall pillar, and the fire was lit. An English soldier reportedly made her a small cross, which she held as the flames rose. She repeatedly called out the name of Jesus until her last breath. Her execution was a public spectacle meant to erase her memory, but it did the opposite. It turned a young warrior into a martyr. About 25 years later, a new trial was authorized by the Pope. It investigated the original proceedings and declared Joan innocent, nullifying the verdict. She was officially recognized as a martyr, and in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Joan of Arc's story is a powerful reminder of how faith, courage, and conviction can change the world, and how even in the darkest injustice, a legacy can be born that shines for centuries. Have you ever felt like you were meant for something greater? Like there was a voice inside you, pushing you towards a destiny you couldn't ignore? Today, let's talk about a young woman who listened to that voice and changed the course of history. This is the incredible story of Joan of Arc. Picture this. It's the 15th century, and France is in chaos. The 100 Years' War with England has been raging for decades, leaving the country torn apart and demoralized. The French throne is in dispute, and a large part of northern France is under English control. It's a dark, desperate time. Into this turmoil steps a young, uneducated peasant girl from a small village named Dummer. Her name is Joan. She can't read or write, and her future seems set. She'll likely marry, work to lend, and live a quiet, unremarkable life. But Joan is anything but ordinary. From the age of 13, she claims to hear divine voices and see visions of saints, like St. Michael and St. Catherine. At first, these voices are personal, guiding her. But as she gets older, the message becomes crystal clear and earth-shatteringly bold. God has chosen her, a teenage farm girl, for a mission to drive the English out of France and see uncrowned heir, Charles VII, crowned as the rightful king in the city of Reims. Imagine the audacity of this. A young woman with no military training, no political connections, and no social standing, declaring she has a divine mandate to lead an army. Naturally, people are skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Her own family probably thought she was delusional. When she first approaches the local commander, Robert de But, to ask for an escort to the royal court, he literally laughs her off. But Joan is persistent. Her conviction is unshakable. She's not just hopeful, she's certain. This unwavering faith starts to win people over. Her predictions of a French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings come true, which makes even the cynical commander think twice. Maybe there's something to this girl's claims, after all. Finally, he agrees to provide her with an escort. Joan cuts her hair short, dresses in men's clothing for safety, and embarks on a dangerous 11-day journey across enemy territory to reach Charles the When she arrives at the royal court, the skepticism is even thicker. The court is full of seasoned politicians and military leaders who see her as, at best, a harmless, eccentric, and at worst, a heretic or a fraud. To test her, Charles even disguises himself among his courtiers. But Joan, who has never seen him before, walks straight to him and identifies him, reportedly sharing a secret with him that convinces him of her divine mission. After a thorough examination by theologians who find nothing improper, a desperate Charles decides to take a massive gamble. What does he have to lose? His situation is dire. He gives Joan command of an army, and what happens next is nothing short of miraculous. In May 1429, Joan arrives at the besieged city of Orleans, a strategic point that the English had been trying to capture for months. She doesn't just show up, she inspires the downtrodden French soldiers with her piety and ferocious courage. Waving her banner, she leads from the front lines, and in just 9 days, the siege is broken. The English are forced to retreat. This victory is a monumental turning point. It feels like a sign from God, and it electrifies the French. Joan becomes a living legend. The Maid of Orleans, her triumph paves the way for a series of stunning victories, clearing a path to Reims, just as her visions foretold. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII is crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing proudly by his side. She had accomplished the impossible. A teenage girl from nowhere had restored a king and revived the spirit of a nation. Of course, Joan's story doesn't end there, and it takes a tragic turn. But her initial rise from an unknown peasant to a national hero is one of the most powerful stories of faith, courage, and determination ever told. It shows that sometimes, the most unlikely. For over a century, the fields of France were soaked in blood. This wasn't just a war. It was a relentless, brutal struggle that we now call the 100 Years' War. But for the people living through it, it was an eternity of conflict between the crowns of England and France. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if your village would be the next one burned to the ground. This was the reality for generations. The war started in 1337, sparked by a complex web of territorial claims and dynastic rivalries. The English kings, who had French ancestry, believed they had a legitimate claim to the French throne. The French, of course, disagreed. What followed was a series of devastating campaigns that crisscrossed the French countryside. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Places like Caen and Limoges witnessed horrific massacres, where soldiers, driven by greed and desperation, looted, burned, and killed without mercy. The once bustling streets fell silent, filled only with the echoes of tragedy. This wasn't just a war fought by knights in shining armor on distant battlefields. It reached into every home, tearing families apart. Loyalties were constantly tested. A brother might swear allegiance to the English-backed Burgundians, while another remained loyal to the French Valois king. These divisions weren't just political, they were deeply personal, creating rifts in families and communities that would take generations to heal. The social fabric of France was unraveling thread by thread. At the heart of this chaos was a weakened French monarchy. King Charles VI, who suffered from severe mental illness, was often incapable of ruling. His court was a viper's nest of intrigue and betrayal, with powerful nobles vying for control. This power vacuum allowed the English to make significant gains, at one point controlling vast swaths of northern France, including Paris itself. For the average French person, it seemed as though their nation was on the brink of complete collapse. The future was a dark, uncertain void, but even in the darkest of times, seeds of change were being sown. The constant warfare forced both sides to innovate. The English longbow, a simple yet deadly weapon, proved its worth at battles like Crécy and Agincourt, changing the face of medieval warfare forever. In response, the French invested heavily in professionalizing their army and developing powerful artillery, which would prove decisive in the later stages of the war. These arms race, born from desperation, laid the groundwork for modern military tactics. Then, a figure of hope emerged from the most unlikely of places. A young peasant girl named Joan of Arc, claiming divine guidance, rallied the demoralized French forces. Her incredible charisma and strategic victories, most notably lifting the siege of Orleans, turned the tide of the war. She reignited a sense of national pride and unity among the French people. Though her own story ended in tragedy, her spirit lived on. Inspired by her example, the French pushed back, slowly but surely reclaiming their land. By 1453, the war finally sputtered to an end. The English were driven out of all their French territories, except for the port of Calais. The cost was immense. France was scarred, its population decimated, and its economy in ruins. But from the ashes of this century-long conflict, a new France began to rise. The war had forged a stronger sense of national identity. No longer were people just Burgundians or Gascons. They were French. The monarchy, tested by fire, emerged more centralized and powerful than ever before. The 100 Years' War was a brutal, agonizing chapter in history, but it also marked the painful birth of modern France and set. Ever heard of a teenage girl leading an entire army to victory? It sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, but this is the real story of Joan of Arc, a figure who completely turned the tide of a century-long war. Let's dive into one of her most legendary moments. The Siege of Orleans. Picture this. It's 1429. France is on its knees, locked in the brutal 100 Years' War with England. The strategic city of Orleans is under siege, and its fall seems inevitable. If Orleans goes, France goes. The French forces are demoralized, outnumbered, and on the brink of collapse. Morale is at an all-time low. It felt like the end of the line for the French crown. Then, out of nowhere, a 17-year-old peasant girl from a remote village shows up. Her name is Joan. She claims she's been sent by God on a mission to save France. Now, you can imagine the skepticism. Generals, nobles, and seasoned soldiers looked at this young, uneducated girl and probably thought she was delusional. But Joan was different. She had an unshakable conviction, an aura of certainty that was both baffling and incredibly compelling. After a series of intense examinations by theologians, the desperate Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, decides to take a massive gamble. He gives her a suit of armor, a banner, and a small contingent of soldiers. When Joan arrived at Orleans, the atmosphere was electric. The French soldiers, who had been beaten down for months, saw her not just as a leader, but as a divine messenger. They believed she was a living miracle, proof that God was on their side. This wasn't just a boost in morale, it was a complete spiritual transformation of the army. Suddenly, these exhausted, fearful men were filled with a new kind of courage, a holy fire. They felt invincible, believing that with Joan leading them, they simply could not lose. Joan didn't just stand on the sidelines, either. She was right there on the front lines, bannering and inspiring everyone with her fearlessness. She wasn't a trained military strategist in the traditional sense, but her instincts were incredible. She urged the French commanders to take aggressive action, to stop waiting and start fighting. On Mai Quattro Teache, she led a charge against the English fortress of St. The French, energized by her presence, fought with a ferocity the English hadn't seen before and captured the fort. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Joan led assaults on other English strongholds around the city. During one intense battle, she was wounded by an arrow to the shoulder. For any other soldier, that would have been the end. But Joan pulled the arrow out herself, had the wound dressed, and returned to the fight. Seeing their maid injured, and yet still fighting, her soldiers were moved beyond words. Their belief in her divine protection intensified. If she could survive that, what couldn't they do? This moment was a massive psychological blow to the English. They had heard whispers of this prophesied maid who would defeat them. Now, seeing her in action, their confidence crumbled. They started to believe the rumors, to fear her. Their formidable reputation began to crack. They were fighting not just the French army, but a force they were starting to believe was supernatural. Just 9 days after Joan's arrival, the unthinkable happened. The English, who had besieged Orleans for over 7 months, completely abandoned the siege and they were broken, not just militarily, but psychologically. Joan had done it. A teenage girl had achieved what the most experienced generals in France could not. The news spread like wildfire. The Maid of Orleans became a legend overnight. Her victory wasn't just a military one. It was a powerful symbol of hope and national pride for the French people. It proved that one person's unwavering faith and courage could indeed change the course of history. This incredible victory at Orleans was the turning point of the 100 Years' War. It paved the way for Charles VII to be crowned king, solidifying his legitimacy and uniting France. Joan's story shows us the immense power of belief and how a single, determined individual can inspire. Ever wonder why a teenage girl who led an army to victory was burned at the stake? The story of Joan of Arc is more than just a tale of faith and courage. It's a story of power, fear, and the system fighting to protect itself. Let us peel back the layers and understand why Joan was seen as such a profound threat to the most powerful men of her time. First, let's set the scene. It's the 15th century, and the 100 Years' War is. France is on its knees, demoralized and divided. The English and their Burgundian allies control huge swaths of territory, including Paris. The French heir, the Dauphin Charles, is weak, uncrowned, and losing hope. Society is rigidly hierarchical. Your place was determined by birth, wealth, and gender. Kings ruled, noblemen fought, and clergy prayed. And women, their roles were strictly defined and domestic. Then, out of nowhere, comes Joan, a peasant girl from a remote village, claiming to hear voices from God. She walks into the Dauphiness court and says God has sent her to lift the siege of Orleans and see him crowned king at Reims. Imagined the audacity. In a world where women had no public voice, especially not in military or political affairs, here was a teenager telling the future king what to do. Her success was her first crime. Against all odds, she inspired the flagging French army. She rode into battle, banner in hand, and led them to a stunning victory at Orleans. This wasn't just a military win. It was a miracle in the eyes of the common soldier and the French people. Her fame exploded. She was the Maid of Orleans, a living saint sent by God. But to those in power, this was terrifying. Think about it from the perspective of a French general. You've trained your whole life in the art of war. You come from a long line of nobility, and suddenly you're taking orders from an uneducated teenage girl. Her authority didn't come from a title or a bloodline. It came directly from God. Or so she claimed. This completely bypassed the established chain of command. She wasn't just leading an army. She was challenging the very idea that power and authority belonged only to the aristocracy. Now, let's look at the church leaders. The church was the ultimate authority in medieval Europe. It was the gatekeeper to God. Theologians and bishops interpreted scripture and doctrine for the masses, but Joan claimed to have a direct line to the divine. She didn't need a priest to interpret God's will for her. Saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret spoke to her personally. This was a direct threat to the church's monopoly on spiritual authority. If anyone could just claim to talk to God, what was the purpose of the entire religious hierarchy? It made them look redundant. She was, in their eyes, a rogue agent, an uncontrollable spiritual force that undermined their power. And what about the English and their Burgundian allies? For them, Joan was a political and propaganda nightmare. Their claim to the French throne rested on the idea that God was on their side. But Joan's victories suggested the opposite, that God favored the French. To counter this, they had only one option: to discredit her. They couldn't just say she was a good general. They had to prove her divine mission was a fraud. They had to paint her not as a saint, but as a heretic, a witch, a tool of the devil. If her power came from hell, then her victories were illegitimate, and God was still on England's side. Her capture by the Burgundians was the perfect opportunity. They sold her to the English, who put her on trial for heresy. But this wasn't a fair trial seeking justice. It was a political show trial designed to destroy her reputation and, by extension, the legitimacy of the king she had crowned. The charges against her were telling. They accused her of heresy for her claims of divine revelation. They also fixated on the fact that she wore men's clothing. This wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a violation of biblical law and a symbol of her rejection of the traditional female role. By wearing armor and leading men, she was subverting the natural order of things. Ultimately, Joan's greatest crime was that she didn't fit. She was a peasant who commanded nobles, a woman who led an army, a Lapisan who claimed a direct connection to God. She broke every rule of her society. Her very existence was a challenge to the foundations of political, religious, and social power. The men who condemned her weren't just punishing a single person. They were trying to crush the idea that power could come from somewhere other than inheritance and institution. They burned her to send a message. This is what happens when you step out of line. But in doing so, they created a martyr, a symbol of defiance whose... Hello history lovers, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the final, tragic chapter of a story that has captivated the world for centuries: the trial and execution of Joan of Arc. How did a 19-year-old girl, a national hero who had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War, end up captured and condemned? Let's unravel this complex and heartbreaking tale. After her spectacular victory at Orleans, Joan's momentum seemed unstoppable. She had led the French army to crown their king, Charles VII, at Reims. Defeat, many thought, impossible, but war is unpredictable. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside the town of Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. This was the moment her enemies had been waiting for. King Charles, despite everything Joan had done for him, made no serious attempt to rescue her. Whether due to political calculation, jealousy, or simple powerlessness, he abandoned the young woman who had secured his crown. The Burgundians saw a golden opportunity. They sold Joan to their English allies for a hefty sum of 10,000 livres. For the English, this wasn't just about capturing a high-value prisoner. It was about dismantling a symbol. Joan's victories were a deep humiliation, and they needed to discredit her in the most public and damning way possible. They couldn't just execute her as a prisoner of war. That would make her a martyr. They needed to destroy her reputation, her divine mission, and everything she stood for. The plan was to brand her a heretic, a witch, a deviant, to prove her voices were not from God, but from the devil. This set the stage for one of history's most infamous trials. Joan was moved to Rouen, a city firmly under English control. The trial was orchestrated by Pierre Couchine, the Bishop of Beauvais, a pro-English cleric with ambitions of his own. The entire proceeding was a political show trial masquerading as a religious inquiry. The deck was stacked against Joan from the start. The court was filled with English sympathizers. She was denied a legal advisor, held in a secular prison guarded by English soldiers, instead of in a church prison guarded by nuns, and subjected to constant psychological pressure. Yet, despite being an illiterate peasant girl facing a court of educated theologians and lawyers, Joan was brilliant. The trial transcripts, which miraculously survive, show her sharp wit and unshakable faith. When asked if she was in God's grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a theological trap, and she navigated it perfectly. Any other answer could have been used against her. She parried their trick questions for months, frustrating her accusers with her simple, unwavering conviction. They questioned her about her male clothing, her visions, her king, and her faith, but she refused to betray her conscience. But her captors were determined to get a conviction. Unable to trap her with her own words, they resorted to coercion and deceit. After months of grueling interrogation and threats of torture, they finally broke her. They presented her with a document of abjuration, a confession. Weakened and facing the stake, Joan signed it, though it's likely she didn't understand what she was agreeing to. As part of the deal, she was supposed to be moved to a church prison and allowed to wear women's clothes, but this was just another trick. Days later, her male clothes were placed back in her cell. Whether she put them on willingly to protect herself from her guards or was forced into them, the result was the same. By resuming male attire, she was declared a relapsed heretic. For Bishop Cauchin and the English, this was the final checkmate. There was no coming back from that charge. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old marketplace in Rouen. She was tied to a tall stake and burned alive. She was just 19 years old. The English wanted revenge, and they got it. The Burgundians wanted power, and they used Joan as a pawn to secure it. Many powerful men on Botsy feared this young woman more than any army, but in their attempts to erase her, they made her eternal. 25 years later, a new trial authorized by the Pope nullified her conviction and declared her a martyr. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, remains a powerful symbol of courage, faith, and defiance against all odds. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a truly somber piece of history. If you found this story as compelling as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more historical tales. Let me know in the comments what you think about Joan's story. Until next time, stay curious.